Now that we have an idea about measures of the economy, we have these three measures with which we're concerned. The idea of GDP growth, of the unemployment rate, and the inflation rate are all ways to measure, I guess, the health of our nation's economy, the economy as a whole. These are our macroeconomic measures that we're concerned with. The question is, or one question may be, how are we going to make our policy decisions such that we can meet some goals for these measures? Those goals are high levels of GDP growth, or at least positive levels of GDP growth, instead of negative, which would be a recession. We want to have the unemployment rate as low as possible. That means getting rid of the cyclical part of unemployment. That is, we want to have the unemployment rate be at the full employment rate, which is probably somewhere between 4 and 6% unemployment. And then finally, we have the idea that inflation is something that is going to be something that we have to deal with. What we want as a policy goal is for there to be no unexpected inflation. What we have learned is that inflation is not really a big deal. That is, changes in the price level is not really a big deal if people know what to expect. And so if people expect there to be 2% inflation, then they can include it in their contracts, they can include it in their long-term investment decisions, they can include that in their longer-term savings and borrowing decisions. We can include that in our labor contracts for cost of living adjustments over time, so that it keeps our real wages at least constant. We adjust those for inflation. But it's the unexpected inflation that tends to cause problems. So if we think about the objective of economic policy, it would be to have stable expected inflation, to have full employment. And that means our economy is producing at capacity, and to experience growth over time. There are two types of government policy, and the first is fiscal policy. That's what we're going to talk about in Chapter 15. We're going to talk about expansionary policy to deal with the business cycle. We're going to think about the different policy options that government policymakers have at their disposal. Discretionary fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, the word fiscal comes from the Latin word fisc, F-I-S-C, and that word fisc means the government treasurer. So these are fiscal policy refers to spending and taxing decisions made by the government. This discretionary fiscal policy is the idea, the notion that we can affect GDP. If you remember, our GDP equation was made up of consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. So that C plus I plus G, that GDP equation that we looked at before, one idea is that it's hard for the government to affect consumption and investment a whole lot, but one of the things they can control directly is the amount of government activity, at least at the federal level. And so one idea is that the federal government can increase government expenditures, in order to increase GDP. And so if we think about what that equation looks like, that GDP is equal to the sum of all these things that include government spending. If you increase government spending, then logically GDP should increase. And so that's where the idea of these stimulus plans that have been used by the government to attempt to get us out of the recession, increase the level of GDP growth by increasing the level of government spending. But we must consider that we can't increase government spending without doing something else, right? We can't just increase G. There has to be, as economists say, there's no such thing as a free lunch. If we want to increase government spending, then we have to, the money must come from somewhere. So that means we either have to increase the amount of money that we collect in taxes, which would cause decreases in consumption and investment, or we must borrow the money. And if we borrow the money, then that's going to change the level of interest rates in the economy and possibly change the level of investment. So it's important to see that there are going to be trade-offs. There must be trade-offs, that when the government increases government spending, then they must get the money from somewhere, and that's going to be through either taxing or borrowing, or the third way would be to increase the amount of money in circulation. And we've seen that there are side effects of all those things, that if we increase government spending by increasing taxes, then we can expect there to be lower levels of consumption. If we increase government spending by borrowing, then we can expect interest rates to rise and there possibly be lower levels of investment. And if we increase government spending by simply printing more money, then we can expect there to be inflation. So there's no free lunch. There are always going to be trade-offs. We just have to see if the trade-off is going to be one that's a net benefit. That is, if the increases in GDP can be or can outweigh the side effects of the treatment. That is to say, we have to be able to measure those trade-offs the best we can in order to make effective policy decisions. So that's kind of a tough one, I suppose. The idea of changing taxes alone, is that if we want GDP to grow, then we can simply decrease the amount of taxes we collect. If less money flows into the government, that means consumers will have more money to use for consumption expenditures. That means consumers will have, or that means firms will have more money that they can keep and distribute as profits, or more money that they can keep and use for capital investments. But if we want to keep the equation balanced, then we have to say, well, if we decrease the amount of taxes we collect, we're going to have to decrease the amount of government spending, possibly. What we've seen over time is that the government tends to finance these things by borrowing, which as we can see in Europe, can have its own side effects and consequences as well. Borrowing to finance these either cuts in tax revenues. It's important to see that we're talking right now about cutting the amount of taxes we collect, not necessarily changing the tax rates. We have to remember that changes in tax rates are something that both consumers and managers of firms are going to react to. That is, we don't have a static economy, we have a very dynamic one, and so that changes in tax rates are going to affect behavior in both business decision making and personal consumption and investment decisions. So it is not necessarily the case that decreasing tax rates will decrease the amount of tax revenues that we collect. It is also not necessarily the case that increasing tax rates will increase the tax revenue to the government. So those are it's important that we note that that we have a very dynamic economy, and that people will react to those changes in tax rates. When we're thinking about this, we're thinking about the changes in the amount that we collect tax revenues. So it gets a little bit complicated, I guess. One of the things, one of the things that we have in place are, because those, if we look back, because those fiscal policy measures literally take an act of Congress, and so can often be slow to move through. We have some things that are in place that will necessarily change in response to changes in GDP. That is, we have progressive income taxes, so that if overall income goes down, average tax rates decrease, and if average tax rates decrease, then that means that the amount that consumers pay in taxes are going to fall, holding everything else constant, and so that we can have kind of a cut in taxes that automatically occurs without Congress or the president having to act. They're already in place. Likewise, we have unemployment insurance that when we have that recessionary period and unemployment rises, government spending automatically kicks in and say increases government spending in response to that recessionary period of the business cycle. But again, these things are not without consequences, so we have to remember that as we go through. So there are two kinds of, our textbook calls them supply-siders. We have people who have a belief in how the economy works that are referred to as Keynesians, and some that are referred to as classical supply-siders or new classical economists. So there's kind of a policy debate, and it goes like this, and it's pretty well summed up in this illustration here. I was thinking about the Keynesians. The Keynesian idea, and this comes from John Maynard Keynes, who was from Britain and won a Nobel Prize and is one of the principal actors in the field that we call monetary economics. In response to the Great Depression, we had always seen these business cycles, but we had always seen the recessionary period followed by a recovery and expansionary period following. We get into the Depression era, and the recession keeps going and going and going. In fact, they defined it a depression, and we say, well, how can we change things around? And the Keynesian idea is that we can if we cut tax rates, that disposable income then increases, and that people buy more goods and services. And there's the idea that aggregate demand increases. So demand for all goods and services kind of increase, and the economy grows. We get growth in real GDP. We might have some inflation though, but the level of unemployment should fall accordingly as well. A different view is that when we cut tax rates, that people have the incentive to work more to earn higher levels of income. And so instead of getting higher levels of demand, we get higher levels of supply, and those higher levels of supply are going to increase output without a necessarily. In this case, there won't necessarily be an increase in inflation or an increase in the price level. We get increases in GDP and we get decreases in unemployment, but for different theoretical underpinnings, I suppose. The big difference in these two are the idea that this same mechanism on the right works for the Keynesian belief that the same mechanism works for increases in government spending. The increases in government spending would lead to higher income and so forth, just like the decrease in tax cuts. However, the Keynesian view would result in bigger increases in GDP as a result of an increase in government spending than a decrease in tax rates. And that's where the real debate is. See, if we think about the tax rate cuts, they both reach the same conclusion, except for a little bit difference in inflation. The supply-siders would say if you increase government spending, you are now consuming more resources through government and fewer resources through the private sector, which means that that we're simply shifting resources from one use to another. That is, the opportunity cost of the resources seems big to the people who believe this side of the story, and seems small to the people that believe this side of the story. So read up more on the idea of the supply-siders versus the Keynesians, and we'll get you some more information on that. And make sure you do your homework, and we'll see you next time.